Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into two presidents who left an indelible mark on American politics. Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump.
Yes.
And it might surprise you to know that both of these presidents, despite their vastly different backgrounds and approaches to leadership, campaigned on the same slogan.
Make America great again.
Make America great again.
Yeah.
So our exploration today, we're going to delve into their campaigns, presidencies, and legacies, drawing parallels, and also highlighting the divergences. Ultimately, we want to give you a nuanced understanding of these two really iconic figures in American political history.
I think it's fascinating how both Reagan and Trump, despite being unconventional candidates, really resonated with the American public and ascended to the presidency.
And their backgrounds, right. Certainly not typical.
Not at all.
For presidential hopefuls.
No.
Reagan, a Hollywood actor.
Right.
Trump, a well-known businessman and reality TV personality.
Exactly. And yet they both managed to tap into a yearning for a perceived better past, a sentiment that resonated with voters across the political spectrum.
So let's start with their campaigns. Let's examine their campaign strategies. Reagan's 1980 campaign, with its Morning in America theme, was just a masterclass in optimism and the effective use of television. He presented himself as a relatable, trustworthy figure, someone who embodied the American spirit.
Reagan's communication skills were phenomenal.
Yeah.
Honed during his years in Hollywood, he was a natural. He knew how to connect with an audience to project warmth and sincerity. His speeches were meticulously crafted.
Yeah.
They were designed to evoke feelings of hope and unity, painting a picture of a brighter future under his leadership.
And his landslide victory speaks for itself. Now, in contrast, Trump's 2016 campaign took a much more aggressive approach, I'd say even confrontational.
Right.
And he very skillfully leveraged social media, in particular Twitter, to bypass the traditional media and directly engage with his supporters.
Trump's campaign messaging often centered on themes of economic nationalism, immigration control, and a very scathing critique of the political establishment. And his rhetoric, it resonated with voters who felt disillusioned with traditional politics and wanted to see someone who promised to shake things up.
His rallies were packed with enthusiastic supporters, and his Make America Great Again slogan became a rallying cry for those who felt that America had lost its way.
Absolutely.
Specific examples really highlight these differences. Just consider Reagan's polished oratory versus Trump's lock-her-up chants, which targeted his political opponent.
These contrasting styles reflect, I think, not only their individual personalities, but also the evolving media landscape and the changing nature of political discourse.
Now let's turn to their economic policies. Reagan's approach, dubbed Reaganomics, was rooted in supply-side economics. The core principles, pretty straightforward. Cut taxes, particularly for high earners, with the expectation of benefits trickling down, and reduce government regulation to stimulate economic growth.
The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 is a really great example of this approach in action.
Yeah.
It significantly reduced tax rates for high-income earners with the theory that this would encourage investment, job creation, and ultimately benefit all Americans through a revitalized economy.
A rising tide, they said, would lift all boats.
Exactly.
Now, Trump's economic agenda, branded as America First, while it shared some similarities with Reaganomics, also had distinct features.
Yeah. Absolutely. Trump's focus on protectionism, particularly through tariffs targeting China, marked a real departure from Reagan's emphasis on free market principles.
Right.
He imposed tariffs on a really wide range of goods, aiming to protect American industries and jobs from what he perceived as unfair competition.
His renegotiation of trade deals, such as replacing NAFTA with a USMCA, further underscored his commitment to putting American economic interests first and front and center.
Yes.
And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which reduced corporate tax rates to boost business investment, also aligns with this approach.
I think it's fair to say that both presidents sought to stimulate the economy and promote American prosperity, but their methods differed significantly.
Right.
Reagan favored a more hands-off approach, emphasizing free markets and deregulation. Trump, however, was much more willing to intervene in the market, using tariffs and trade deals to try to shape global trade in ways that he believed would benefit American businesses and workers.
Moving beyond policy specifics, it's important to acknowledge that both Reagan and Trump possessed undeniable charisma,
Oh, yeah.
though their leadership styles differed significantly.
Oh, absolutely.
Reagan was often referred to as the great communicator.
Yeah.
His calm demeanor, charm, and ability to connect with people through his oratory skills earned him widespread admiration.
His background as a Hollywood actor undoubtedly played a role in shaping his public persona.
Yeah.
He projected this image of warmth and optimism even during challenging times. His ability to unite people through his words, to offer reassurance, and instill confidence was really a hallmark of his presidency.
Consider his famous speech at the Berlin Wall, right? Where he challenged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. A powerful moment that really encapsulated his firm stance against communism and his unwavering belief in freedom and democracy. And now let's contrast that with Trump's leadership style.
Yeah, Trump projected strength and confidence, but his approach was far more confrontational and I think often polarizing.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to use inflammatory language, and he often directly targeted his critics,
Right.
And he skillfully tapped into the anger and frustration of his supporters, presenting himself as a champion for those who felt ignored by the political establishment.
His unprecedented use of social media, right, allowed him to circumvent traditional media filters and connect with his base in a very raw, unfiltered way.
Absolutely.
He tweeted frequently, often making very controversial statements that garnered headlines and fueled both praise and outrage.
I think these contrasting leadership styles reflect not only their personalities, but also, again, the changing media landscape and the evolving nature of political discourse.
Right.
Reagan's approach was tailored to a pre-internet era where television and traditional media played a dominant role in shaping public opinion. Trump, on the other hand, mastered the art of using social media to control the narrative and connect directly with voters.
Both men found success, but through vastly different approaches.
Yes.
Reagan sought to unify, Trump aimed to disrupt, and both of those strategies resonated with their respective audiences. Now, next we'll delve into their foreign policy approaches.
So, Reagan's foreign policy was largely defined by his hardline stance against the Soviet Union. He famously labeled it the evil empire and adopted a peace through strength doctrine, believing that the best way to deal with the Soviet Union was from a position of military superiority.
Right. He oversaw a significant increase in military spending, including the ambitious Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI,
Star Wars.
Star Wars, which aimed to develop a space-based missile defense system to shield the United States from a potential Soviet nuclear attack.
I think it's important to remember, though, that while Reagan took this very firm stance against the Soviets, he also recognized the importance of diplomacy.
Yeah.
He engaged in arms control negotiations with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and this culminated in the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987.
It was a landmark treaty
Huge.
that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons and marked a pivotal step towards easing those Cold War tensions.
Yeah.
And it showed that Reagan, while he was committed to a strong national defense, was also willing to pursue those diplomatic solutions.
Absolutely.
Now, turning to Trump's foreign policy, we see a more transactional approach.
Mhm.
I think he really viewed alliances like NATO with a lot of skepticism, often focusing on the financial aspects and demanding that other member nations contribute more to collective defense.
Mm-hmm.
And, he withdrew the U.S. from several international agreements,
Right.
including the Paris Climate Accord. He argued that it placed an unfair burden on American businesses. He also pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, claiming it was flawed and didn't do enough to address Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Trump's foreign policy was really characterized by this focus on bilateral agreements and a willingness to use tariffs and other economic leverage to pressure other countries into making concessions. He kind of saw global affairs as a series of deals where the U.S. should always strive to come out ahead.
Yeah, and one striking example of this approach was his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. It was unprecedented,
Absolutely.
garnered global attention, and was seen by many as a potential breakthrough in efforts to denuclearize the Korean peninsula.
Yeah, though despite that initial fanfare, the summit ultimately yielded very little in terms of concrete progress. And while it showcased Trump's willingness to engage with adversaries, it also highlighted the limitations of his transactional approach to foreign policy, which often lacked, I think, the patience and the nuance required for those really complex diplomatic negotiations.
Right. So in foreign policy, we see a pretty stark contrast between Reagan's emphasis on this ideological confrontation with the Soviet Union, but combined with a willingness to engage in strategic arms control. And then you have Trump, who's got this more transactional approach focused on securing what he perceived as advantageous deals for the U.S., often at the expense of those multilateral agreements and those longstanding alliances.
These differing approaches really reflect their distinct worldviews and their understanding of America's role in the world, I think. Reagan saw the U.S. as a beacon of freedom and democracy, obligated to confront communism and promote American values abroad. Trump, on the other hand, was much more concerned with asserting American sovereignty and pursuing a foreign policy that he believed directly benefited American interests.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and focus on the domestic front and explore their roles in the so-called culture wars, those ongoing debates over social and cultural values that have really profoundly shaped American politics.
Yeah. Reagan aligned himself very closely with the Christian right, a very powerful force within the Republican Party at the time. He frequently spoke about traditional family values and advocated for conservative positions on issues such as abortion and school prayer.
Right. His war on drugs, launched in the 1980s, was another key element of his social agenda, aimed at tackling drug abuse and all of its associated, social ills. But, this initiative, while I think well-intentioned, had some unintended consequences.
The war on drugs led to a really dramatic increase in incarceration rates that disproportionately impacted minority communities.
Right.
And it's really contributed to the mass incarceration crisis that we're still dealing with today in the United States.
Reagan's rhetoric, though, I think with its focus on these traditional values and moral clarity, really resonated with a lot of conservative voters. He presented himself as a defender of a way of life that he believed was under threat from, what he saw as these more liberal social trends.
Trump also engaged in the culture wars, though I think his approach differed from Reagan's. He often used much more inflammatory language. He positioned himself as a champion for those who felt that their values were being marginalized, by political correctness and these progressive social movements.
He often targeted what he perceived as liberal bias in the media, academia, and popular culture. Criticized NFL players for kneeling during the national anthem, arguing that it was disrespectful to the flag and the military. He also implemented policies that restricted transgender rights and limited access to reproductive health care.
Trump's rhetoric on immigration was also particularly divisive.
Yeah.
I mean, he portrayed undocumented immigrants as criminals and threats to national security, and he used this framing to justify his administration's very strict immigration policies, including that highly controversial family separation policy at the U.S.-Mexico border.
So, while both Reagan and Trump engaged in these culture wars, I think their objectives and their methods really differed. Reagan sought to unify conservatives around this shared moral vision, emphasizing those traditional values and a return to what he saw as America's moral foundations. Trump, on the other hand, he almost seemed to relish in exploiting those cultural divisions to energize his base and really consolidate his power. He was, I think, less interested in promoting a specific set of values and more focused on tapping into a sense of grievance and resentment among his supporters.
Their contrasting approaches reflect not only their personalities, but also, again, the evolving nature of the culture wars themselves. I mean, Reagan's engagement with these issues occurred during a period when conservative social movements were gaining momentum, pushing back against those liberal social changes of the 1960s and 1970s. Trump, on the other hand, came to power in an era of heightened political polarization that was fueled by social media and this, increasingly fragmented media landscape.
So now that we've sort of examined their approaches to foreign policy and their roles in the culture wars, let's move on and try to assess the impacts of their policies and delve into what are really their complex legacies. Both Reagan and Trump implemented policies, right?
Yeah.
And these policies had significant and often unforeseen consequences. I think to fully understand their legacies, we really need to take a look at these impacts.
So let's start with Reagan. His economic policies, while they are often credited with taming inflation and stimulating growth, also led to a pretty sizable increase in the national debt. And the gap between the rich and poor widened, which raised concerns about income inequality.
And the war on drugs, as we've talked about, while initially aimed at addressing drug abuse, had the unintended consequence, really, of mass incarceration, which disproportionately impacted minority communities. This legacy, I think, continues to cast a long shadow over the criminal justice system in the U.S. today, and it perpetuates those social inequalities.
Now, looking at Trump, His signature tax cuts, much like those implemented under Reagan, did provide a short-term boost to the economy, but they also contributed to a really substantial increase in the national deficit.
And his protectionist trade policies, while they were popular with some segments of the population, also sparked those trade wars with other countries and led to increased costs for American consumers.
Right. I mean, the tariffs that he imposed on goods from China, for instance, really disrupted global supply chains and negatively impacted American businesses.
And then there's Trump's immigration policies,
Right.
particularly the family separation policy. I mean, it drew widespread condemnation and really left, I think, a lasting stain on his presidency. Those images of children separated from their parents at the border, I mean, they sparked outrage and really highlighted the human cost of these policies.
Absolutely.
So I think it's clear, right, that both presidents, their policies had really far-reaching and often unintended consequences. Their legacies, I think, continue to be debated today with both the positive and negative aspects really subject to scrutiny.
When we talk about legacies, I think it's important to consider how Reagan and Trump are remembered, and what their lasting impact on the national psyche has been. Reagan's often portrayed as this symbol of optimism and national unity. He's credited with ending the Cold War and restoring American confidence on the world stage.
His folksy charm, his ability to connect with ordinary Americans, and this unwavering belief in American exceptionalism really contributed to his enduring popularity. He's often viewed as a unifying figure, someone who brought the country together after the really, I think, tumultuous 1970s.
Trump, however, remains a much more polarizing figure.
Right.
I mean, his presidency it was marked by division, controversy, and these constant challenges to what we consider democratic norms. His rhetoric was often inflammatory, his behavior often unpredictable, and his policies, I think, deeply divisive.
His refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election and his role in inciting the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol solidified his image as a threat to American democracy in the eyes of many.
So you have Reagan, the unifier, and Trump, the divider.
Right.
And their legacies really reflect not only their policies, but also their personalities, their approaches to leadership.
Absolutely. As we conclude this deep dive into the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, it's striking how two men who shared a campaign slogan could be so different.
Right.
So different in their approaches to governing, their impact on society, and ultimately, their legacies.
Yeah, their presidencies really do offer, I think, this fascinating case study in the evolution of the Republican Party and just the changing dynamics of American politics in general. They highlight the enduring power of personality and ideology, and really how communication shapes the course of American history.
We hope that this exploration has provided you with some valuable insights and a more nuanced understanding of these two presidents and really their profound and lasting impact on American politics and society. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.